And now to introduce today's host. Dr. Julie Reiss is an art historian who directs a master's program at Christie's Education. Julie has presented papers and chaired panels on issues related to art and climate change at conferences including the College Art Association and the Conference for the Council for European Studies. She is the author of From Margin to Center, The Spaces of Installation Art, 1999, and the editor of Art, Theory, and Practice in the Anthropocene, 2018. Reiss is also a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. So, Julie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Cal. Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm very happy to be here to talk with David Brooks today. He is so interesting, and I know you're going to really enjoy hearing from him and seeing the works that he has ready to show. And he and I will help them, and then you'll have some great questions based on the work and the conversation. David Brooks is an artist whose work considers the relationship between the individual and the built and natural environment. His work investigates how cultural concerns cannot be divorced from the natural world, while also questioning the terms under which nature is perceived and utilized. He has had solo exhibitions and major projects at such institutions as the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, Storm King Art Center, MoMA PS1, the Dallas Contemporary, Gallery for Landschaftskunst, and other ones too numerous to mention here. You may have seen in 2011-12, if you were in New York, his Desert Rooftops on view in Times Square, a 5,000 square foot earthwork commissioned by Art Production Fund. And you may also have seen the summer of 2018, the large-scale geologic installation on Governor's Island, rocks, hummingbirds, mosquitoes, commissioned by the Trust for Governor's Island. David Brooks is a recipient of the Rome Prize, a research grant to the Ecuadorian Amazon, which we'll talk about some of those trips today, and a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. He's also a professor at NYU Gallatin. So I'm happy to be here with you today, David.
Thank you, Julie. Nice to be here and share this space with everybody. Hello.
You know, I thought that we could just start off by talking about the very first thing that, that I sort of told people about you, this issue of how you cannot divorce cultural concerns from the natural world. Maybe people talk about the end of the nature-culture binary, that we live in a world where that no longer exists. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit as a thread that runs through your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really large thread and a very long thread, but our perceptions of what we even mean by the natural world is a bit different for every single individual and how they kind of subjectively understand it. But also there is another way of perceiving, which is how we do it kind of culturally as a collective group of people. And so it's that aspect where we really begin to really dictate as a culture what certain things the natural world mean for different people at different times, but also how we impact it and how we affect it. So I think that ever since I was young and started making work, and now some years on now, I see that this intersection of where we construct this notion and how we impact it has become really an accelerated, urgent situation. So I think what I see is that the scale of these things get bigger and the speed of it gets faster. And so for me, it's a very alarming thing, and it's really preoccupied much of my work since then. Yeah, so I think that's a really important underlying foundational aspect. A lot of the artists that are sort of close friends of mine, it's sort of the culture of nature. That meaning that nature is something that, of course, physically there are living organisms and biotic and abiotic matter out there, but there's also nature in terms of how we construct it and make a picture of it in our minds, and that we all agree on as a culture that, like, a bunny rabbit running through a field might get to be called nature, as opposed to, say, a coronavirus. That is that nature, or is that an invention? So we begin to have these different types of conversations in that way.
That makes a lot of sense, especially now where people talk about becoming afraid of nature because of things like wildfires, and you want to say, well, that's actually unnatural. You know, that's not. You don't have
Right.
to say, oh, I'm now scared of nature. Although, you know, as I mentioned to you, and we were talking yesterday, as a deeply urban person myself, I also I understand some of that, and also just the in some ways the alien aspect of nature, if it's something that you don't come into contact with and see all the time. One of the many things I like about your work, which takes on, as you'll all see soon, many varied forms and scales depending on what the situation dictates, is that you manage to deal with sort of the past, deep time, slow time, but also sort of the long future. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about our sense of time. We talk about how now we live in a kind of forever now, right? Everyone's got a very short memory. And yet your work also deals a lot with erasure and the process of remembering. And I wonder if we could just sort of think about that a little bit before you show your images.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to that. One is that in terms of how the motions of my own daily life, I realize are heavily dictated, of course, naturally by previous people and decisions and impacts they've made on the world and previous societies. And that idea of our own responsibility while we are alive and active in this world, that those have repercussions after we're long gone. And so is there a way to kind of make that a more conscious aspect of our life? I think and an artistic practice can kind of begin to intertwine those both abstract notions into a more something that can be experienced. And so I think that's a really important aspect of it, something to bear witness to. So this idea though of time, of what you're talking about, so that's the one hand, is that I will have an impact on somebody else in the future that I will never meet. And that's a really profound idea and reality. The other aspect of that, though, is getting ourselves closer to this notion of evolution and that being able to kind of see it in a way. That in relationship to what I was saying previously about how people impact us, the closer we can get, I think, to understanding and even witnessing evolution itself allows a kind of a sense of responsibility that we must have with our lives. And so it's that sense of responsibility, and which I hope gives a sense of agency. And that's like a thing that I think artwork can also do. And so maybe I'm going to jump in, and because I kind of want to show a few images that we can kind of speak to that. Is this a good time for us?
It's a great time. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so now everybody should see a black screen. But I do, one of the things I do is I spend a lot of time out in the field, and I do once a year, every other year, these expeditions with groups of biologists doing biodiversity surveys throughout the kind of Amazonian rim, or the rim of the basin in South America. This here is a golden-headed manakin. But we're really focusing on fish diversity and biodiversity. Rivers are some of the things that are kind of like the veins that run right through these forests and are some of the first things being attacked on a large scale through hydroelectric dams and artisanal gold mining. These are all fish from the same family of fish called Loricariidae. This is one that's evolved to look like wood, and this is one that's evolved to be able to eat wood, same family. So you can see the kind of wonderment of this family of organisms. And that's something that I'm always baffled by and amazed by. It's just that it's such a fantastical realm in the natural world, in our own reality. And so I'm always perplexed and in awe of it. This is the world's smallest hummingbird. This is a bee hummingbird. But for me, the drive behind this is to really bear witness to these things. And scientists can really help me as an artist be able to get closer to that moment where we can actually witness evolution, in a sense, as I was saying before. But this idea of bearing witness and like the kind of, these are not statistics and data, these are living, breathing beings that share the planet with us. And that's a really important sense of ethics and responsibility that I think a lot about. In 2010, this trip here, we were traversing the largest road building project in the world at the time, the Interoceanic Highway. And really, it's, in a sense, it's really just like paving the Amazon. As history shows, in the Amazon, when you build one road officially, thousands of unofficial roads branch off from that. And so what I did here was for PS1 and constructed in the interior galleries of a forest that was kind of a cross section of an Amazonian forest, all species that I had just purchased from nurseries in South Florida and then brought up to New York, and then covered it in 20 tons of concrete, which is an absolutely horrifying idea in a way, but also it's an important aspect of, in my mind, it was almost like collapsing these notions of paving the Amazon with what I witnessed and the horror of that, but creating a situation then that can play out over time at PS1. So here this piece ended up staying for almost 2 years. And so it had numerous life cycles of its own, where it started to regrow and actually send out big canopies of green. So it went through kind of apocalyptic imagery, but at other times, this kind of beautiful surprise at times. Other situations where using these elements of the natural world to kind of confront how we perceive and define the natural world. At Art Basel, Switzerland, arguably the moment where there's the most subjectivity purchased at one time. I wanted to kind of cross the flows of the commodification of subjectivity with the commodification of life itself. And so I brought living lower Caridae fish, which are unknown to science. And so it was an important aspect of them that they were species new to science, but that are actively purchased and traded in the aquarium trade. And so some ichthyologists, those that study fish, when they travel to Europe, they may actually go to people's homes and collectors' homes to actually study their fish collections, because they though these fish here I'm showing came from the Xingu River in Brazil, these scientists maybe don't have funding to get to the Xingu River. And so they can kind of look at these fish in people's homes, and it's an absurd reality, but it is a reality. So here I was bringing these fish into this art fair situation, and people are kind of faced with this moment of, and they could hang out on these bleachers with them, but they're faced with this moment of these 5 living beings that we don't have a scientific species name for them, but they are indeed alive, and they're nearsighted because they live in rapids and things, so they don't really see that far, and they're not really disturbed by people's presence, but they have a kind of alien-like appearance to them. And so it was really shocking for people, like, is this real? Are these actually real fish? And like, yeah. And is this and are they alive? Like, oh yeah. And this is an artwork? Yeah, it is. And they're for sale? They are, in fact. So these fish in the aquarium trade can fetch anywhere between $500 and $25,000 for a living individual. So, but the visitor, the viewer, come to this, and they have to really kind of reconcile with their own sense of like, what is this in front of me? Divorced from any other type of a categorization. And so, the fish then went back to Germany to work, to live out their long life with an ichthyologist in Germany that studies them. Thinking then bigger and more wider and beyond species level, but more about the phenomenon of an ecosystem is something I'm also perplexed by when I say earlier, like, how can we see something? How can we witness something, bear witness to it? And so if I say something like, well, have you been inside of an ecosystem before? That's a strange idea in a way. We can't just walk up to a forest edge and like see ecosystem. Ecosystem is a kind of philosophical and experiential conundrum in a sense. And so this project here, I'd taken a combine harvester and disassembled the combine harvester into all of its thousands of pieces. For those that may not know, a combine harvester is that thing that you see in the Midwest harvesting corn, and it can do 9 different functions at once. So in a way, it's a good stand-in for what an ecosystem is, which is this thing that's doing multiple functions simultaneously, and it's impossible to see all of it in totality in one experience or in one glance. And so it has this complexity that defies the human perceptual capacity. And so here I had taken the combine harvester and separated it, but reorganized it according to ecosystem services. And so each set of groupings of them had a text, wall text, and the way they were titled and arranged that all had a relationship to the ecosystem service they were representing in that moment. Some were brought to really precious level and polished and brass plated. And then others outside were kind of these public works or the outdoor works in a sense. And I'm going to show you just real quick here 2 projects at Storm King that Julie and I were talking about yesterday. Storm King, I'm sure many of you know it, but Storm King is this place about an hour north of New York City, and it's was opened in 1964. It's a place, though, that took them, I think it was about 6 years to sculpt that landscape. And they were sculpting it to kind of help it out, to help it look even more like the Hudson River, kind of the Hudson River school of painting that has a certain kind of idealization of this landscape. So they were, even though this is literally the Hudson Valley and the Hudson River area where Hudson River painters painted, nonetheless, there is this interesting situation where they're sculpting this place to help it out. So in a way, it was like this garden, but with a real machine in the garden. And that's a known kind of trope that Leo Marx developed in 1964, this idea of the machine in the garden, where America, the United States, is really confronted with these 2 situations of the idea of the natural world being a Garden of Eden, but the natural world also being this thing we harvest to fuel industrial progress and so forth. So here I had literally placed the machine back in the garden, and so one can kind of walk around and traverse, but see these sections into the ground and have to kind of assemble them in your mind as you go across it, the way you assemble a landscape as well. And then this last project I'm going to show you here, where also at Storm King, which is known for its really large scale metal sculpture. Here I wanted to do something where I made a lot of little sculptures. And I'd gone around the perimeter, the unmanicured areas of Storm King, and I'd cast, just totally subjectively, just things I found of interest or that looked kind of like a sculpture maybe. And then we cast these ephemeral things and then made a bronze replica and then reinserted them right back next to the thing they were cast from, like a double vision. But there's 3 feet of concrete embedded underneath of that bronze. So they're permanently affixed. And we have a legal agreement with Storm King that they remain there forever, and whatever forever might mean, because forever is a complicated word as well. And so talking about time, as you asked, Julie, like the forever here is something that, does that mean that forever is 10 years? Because what if the hillside has an erosion that happens and it's gone? But also it could be 5 generations from now, or a century from now, or whatever it may be. So the forever aspect is a really important part of this. And that was a way to, in a sense, kind of see or attempt to bear witness to this idea of change into the future, seeing outside of one's own lifespan, and thinking about how the impacts of climate change even on our own psyche, which is, it's a difficult concept, a difficult reality to really wrap your head around, because it's so big, it's so vast, that how can one really, how can one witness it even though it's happening right in front of me? We begin to see it more and more recently, in recent years, with storm events and so forth, and large scales of migration of people having to move out of devastated areas due to climate change related drought. But it's still a difficult thing. So here in the quietude of the woods, you know, one comes across these things and has to think about the fact that it's going to be there forever, whatever that means. And these may also exist as time capsules of species of trees that no longer exist. And so it's this kind of a dichotomy situation set up in that sense. I'm going to switch back here to our view. So yeah, so I think a couple of things for that is how to spark a sense of agency in a viewer, how also to allow an artwork to fold in the various contradictions or almost like human irrationalities that we live with. And so an artwork can kind of let those things live next to each other for a moment to be witnessed and thought about. So. Oh, Julie, I think you're muted, actually.
I love the the machine in the garden. Actually teach Leo Marx with my students. If some of them are listening, they might be. We read an article called The Railroad in the Landscape, which has to do with this uneasiness, this embrace. How do you accept? How do you love? How do you fear? You know, this sort of push and pull relationship with progress and industrialization, especially in the American psyche, where the landscape, you know, sort of looms so large. And I think your own background, coming from sort of farm country in Indiana, you really bring that to the table, almost as though agriculture is sort of in the middle. You have culture, agriculture, and nature. Like if you had a kind of spectrum there, that agriculture sort of becomes a kind of bridge. And I think you play with that in a really, really interesting way. But I'd like to go back a little bit to the permanent field observations, which is something to me that is so profound and fascinating about that work. And I thought we could maybe sort of unpack it a little bit more. You know, before we met today, I was looking up the definition of the word stewardship, thinking, you know, is that a word that we want to sort of use or think about here? And, you know, looking at it sort of defined as knowledge, perception, and responsibility, sort of all rolled into one. And I was thinking about that in terms of the permanent field observations, because you encourage a kind of perception, you mediate it through culture, because in some ways we might see the bronze bit better than we can see the actual stick or piece of bark, whatever you might have there. But in bronzing itself is something we associate with something that's precious and needs to be kept. I just wonder if these ideas were sort of wrapped up into your choice of, you know, of bronzing something. Is there a kind of stewardship there?
That's an interesting interpretation. So stewardship is an interesting notion, because if we look at, say, the history of what if we look at the history of what wilderness even means, wilderness is another one of those complicated words, like the word nature in our language. Wilderness has changed meaning so many times. You know, if you look at biblical times, the idea of wilderness is a place where the infidels are, and to be cast out into the wilderness. Through moving forward into the more modern European centuries, where wilderness is this place for the sublime, you know, to go and actually embrace the fearful infinity of the sublime in that sense. But and you look at the United States and its past couple of centuries of environmental impact and environmental stewardship, the idea of wilderness becomes something different again. You know, like John Muir called aspects of the wilderness like God's cathedral. And so now it's completely switched 180 from the original notion of what we understand to be wilderness. And so wilderness now again has a new definition in a sense, and one could call it that there is a sense of stewardship, that there is this idea around the wilderness and that we have to keep it the wilderness. But even that idea of keeping it the wilderness already sets a kind of delimitation around it, or a delineation around it. And so the idea of stewardship is an interesting one. It's complicated because on the one hand, we're doing the same thing. We're constructing a situation that is part of the very hubris that brought us to these levels of impact.
Absolutely. The idea of stewardship is still extremely human-centered. That, you know, if we have to believe that we have to take care of nature, we are still in some ways the dominant force in nature. But I really did think that because when we think about what it means to bronze something in our culture, it is a sense of preservation. I think that's a little hard to get away from in this particular piece. And honestly, in a way, you could argue there's something hubristic about it as well, because it's almost saying that the organic aspects are probably going to break down while the bronze aspects may endure. So you almost might want to say that it's a kind of looking at that dialogue between nature and culture. Literally, you have them sitting side by side. Right?
Yeah.
The mediated object and the organic object, and what happens when they meet. And what happens when the organic object, you know, washes away in the rain, and what's left is the bronze bit. And yet, because people seem to have such a difficult time perceiving and seeing what is right in front of them, I think it's a beautiful gesture to call attention to those little details. So I think you've got a lot of different things that are going on there. And I think some of them point out some of the troubling aspects of the idea of preservation, of us sort of granting certain areas, those can stay.
Yeah.
Right? But it's problematic, and it also speaks a lot to how we mediate nature through art, through culture. That maybe one of the things that that art can do for us is to help us mediate a relationship with nature that that not everybody has. When you and I were talking yesterday, we talked about your feeling at one point of feeling betrayed almost, that you hadn't known about all these amazing, wonderful things in the world. And through your travels, your field work, you've been able to get up close and hold those objects in your hand. Many people can't do that and don't have that exposure, and yet we want people to feel connected to those things. And I think that in that sense, I think your work brings those things to people to be able to have that direct experience with them. And that alone, I think, is an important gesture. There's the absurd and the complication and the ironic, but there's still somehow you keep that wonder in there. And I wonder, is that something that you consciously think about in how you present these things?
Yeah, there's so much I can talk about just in that that last.
All right, it's a long question. I just sort
No,
of
no, no. There's so I'm just debating which part to go towards. I mean, I do want to say first though about the notion of preservation first before we move off of that. Just that it is absolutely still incredibly vital and necessary that preservation does happen. So what I was just prefacing with all of that was just that it's complicated because that project at PS1 of the forest, I specifically called preserved forest. The irrationality, the incongruity of preserving this thing is also in a way destroying it in another way. But then there's another unknown aspect that comes out of it, which is its regrowth. And that's the unknown is not something I can necessarily predict or define. And so that's a really important part of that. And I think though, in terms of, yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate that I have been able to devote a lot of time to being able to travel and be out in what we might call the elements, and yeah, I'm always just amazed that there's not millions of people just kind of wandering up, like staring into a tree and just amazed that we have these things around us, these beings, these non-humans that are have a whole other set of knowledge and instincts to them that I don't have. And so I'm really just always extraordinarily in all of that. But I think also part of this is that in terms of an artwork, like what artwork can do is bring those elements together at a moment. Again, that something can be witnessed, but I think of them often as like situations more so than say a sculpture or a static sculpture. It's always a kind of situation that has something that plays out through it. And so I hope that thing that plays out is part of a viewer trying to wrap their head around these kind of irrational aspects that are our world, and something like to set aside a preserve is absolutely important with our way of life, and yet it is at the same time also a delineation culturally of like nature over there, humans over here. And so it's an interesting situation. I think that the more those contradictions, those irrationalities can be lived with and experienced and legible, the more we can kind of begin to see these things and have a sense of moving. I'm not sure that the word would be moving forward, but being more responsible and ethically minded people about how we move as a culture, in a sense. That kind of answered your question, but there's a lot to talk about.
You answered very well, but just sort of as a little corollary to that, when you made the piece at PS1, did you know that things would somehow manage to grow through that concrete, or was that a surprise?
Well, I knew that there are certain species I was using that are that have been domesticated from the tropics and used in city environments because they are very resilient and actually sometimes even thrive on disturbance. So certain types of trees that have evolved to really succeed along, say, a riverbank where there might be levels of flooding and erosion that they have to constantly deal with. they can kind of take over that space and thrive, whereas other species can't. So they found a place they can really develop. And so I knew that some of them would. I didn't realize, though, that it would actually go through that many life cycles that it did. And in fact, it was absorbing so much moisture through the leaves. Once concrete would crack off of it, moisture would just kind of absorb through the leaves into the tree, and the tree would send it down into the roots. And so underneath 4 or 5 feet of concrete below, the soil, when we finally jackhammered the thing apart, the soil below there was just like a wet, soupy mud. It was so full of moisture. So it's an interesting phenomenon, that unknown. I mean, same with, you don't really know how things are going to unfold. Same with the fish that we brought in from, I always say we when I'm talking about projects, because it takes a team, it takes a group of people. It's never just me chiseling away at this like forest there, or chiseling away in my studio by myself with these fish. In fact, more so the idea is to engage and incorporate almost like a nexus or a cluster, all these different elements of the world that I have to face, that we all are living through, bringing as many of those in at one time as possible to press in upon each other. But
I think the unknown and the unpredictable is a very important part here. We talk a little bit about the Anthropocene and this sort of that came about through this notion of domination of nature being there for the taking, nature as resources that can be extracted, nature that could be controlled, and the irony of all of that activity actually leading to a very unpredictable nature that's very uncontrolled. And I think that in a sort of microcosm, your preserving the forest showed that, the way you can see wild cornflowers sprouting up in the subway tracks when they go outside, at Smith and 9th Street on the F train. I always look out the window and look at the things that somehow are managing to live through there. It also reminds me, when I've talked with other groups about art in the climate crisis, sometimes people say, well, the earth is going to be fine. It's us that won't be. We don't have to worry about the earth. The earth will recover itself. It will just do so without us on it. And I feel that somehow in something like the preserving a forest piece, you have something of that perseverance of the long future where things will grow. They may be growing without us being here, but they may somehow, they may have the last word at the end of the day. So I think of this as a kind of optimistic thought, but maybe it's just me.
Well, no, on the one hand, there will still be a biosphere, even if it may take, if a nuclear war breaks out, it will devastate human life and will take a lot of other species with us. But eventually, around 6 million years or so, the atmosphere, the biosphere will stabilize itself again, and it'll be a different kind of situation. So the irony being that many scientists would consider human beings a debt species, meaning it's a species that we know will go extinct in a matter of time. It's just a matter of when. And we already kind of perform many of the very things that we observe in the natural world of other debt species, those that render themselves at a certain point, one that must go extinct in a sense. And yet, so it's a strange contemplation of death in that way. And so I think that hubris, though, of it goes two ways. On the one hand, I am careful when trying to make too large of a claim on an idea of what is conservation of our natural world, because there are a lot of things we just don't know, and that there are things that the mockingbird that's always chirping right outside my window at 3 a.m. There are things that mockingbird knows that I don't know. There are strains of DNA that mockingbird is a part of a fluid motion of that I'm not. And so there's an unknown quality to that is, for me, is always the part that's also one of the wonderments that I was talking about, and but also something that makes me cautious. Like this, you know, we're seeing things like in South Florida, there are certain coral species that are actually beginning to thrive in these heated acidic waters. That's not a moment of celebration. It's just saying that actually it's not all things do get annihilated, and so that that hubris goes both ways in a sense.
Oh, absolutely, and I guess the unpredictability. On that note, can you show the Governor's Island piece? Because I actually think it would fit in really well with what we're talking about here, and sort of slow time and fast time and the long run.
Let's see here. Yeah, so here, for those that are not listening in here that are not in New York, oh, and I have a train going by that goes by about once an hour outside my house here. So don't be alarmed if the computer screen starts to shake. But Governor's Island is that island that it sets off the tip of Manhattan. It was actually the first inhabited island and the first developed island with the Dutch before Manhattan, in fact. And it was a known Lenape indigenous fishing camp. It was a seasonal camp. There was not a township that's known that was there permanently living. It was a seasonal fishing camp and they called it Nut Island. And so the Dutch called it Nut Island also. And that continued until the Americans took Governor's Island away from the British. So Governor's Island, though, is an interesting thing because its original size is, I forget how many square acres, but not that big. 2/3, if not 3/4 of the island is all fill from the subway system. And so especially the Lexington line, the 456 there, the excavation of that to build the subway was what built Governor's Island. And then Governor's Island became a military outpost from day one with the Dutch and then the British and then the Americans. And so it has this really deep history in the United States of being a military outpost, and had always been this kind of big, glaring monument of colonialism and military might. That it was not until around, I think it was Bill Clinton, who actually then decommissioned the island from the military. It was actually Coast Guard at that point, and then sold it to the city for $1 on the one condition that it not be developed for private residences. And so it's to be this kind of cultural island of sorts. They're still, for the last 20 years, have been trying to really figure out how to work this strange situation of a military outpost for 3 centuries into a public access, a public park in a sense. So I was asked to do this project there, and I kind of, the military and colonial history of the island is very clear and legible and preserved. And in order to think beyond that colonial period and put that colonial period into a larger perspective of like how kind of minuscule our time of human evolution and impact on the planet has been. I want to kind of blow right past that and move straight into deep time, into the deep rock core of the island. So I commissioned this rotosonic drill, which is a coring drill that uses sound waves to actually break up the front at the tip of the drill bit. And we excavated at 3 different sites on the original historic footprint of the island, as close to these historic kind of military structures as we could, and extracted these rock core sections that go back to 541 million years. And so it was a way to create a different kind of a timeline and next to this this other kind of situation. And then, but how to actually display it? Like, am I just going to make a line? Well, it's hard to relate to a rock. So the idea for me was like, I'm going to find what are the life forms around me, around this very specific context that I can draw from and actually help the formation of. And so Asian tiger mosquitoes breed in the old fort there, which is where I ended up installing the piece. And so Asian tiger mosquitoes coming to the United States in the 80s, with New York being the northernmost point of the Asian tiger mosquito. So I found studies on flight paths of these mosquitoes, as well as of hummingbirds, because the ruby-throated hummingbird breeds on the island as well. And then laid the rock core materials out in this subterranean architecture of the old fort there. following the pathways, flight paths of a ruby-throated hummingbird and an Asian tiger mosquito. So it was this collapsing of kind of almost instant time, in a sense. Like the mosquito, you can kind of slap dead, or in a sense, you don't think about it as having any time, with this other deep time situation. In fact, the mosquito, ever since the Zika virus, with Zika, the National Science Foundation threw millions of dollars into mosquito research. And so we actually learned a lot about mosquitoes since the advent of Zika. And one of the things we learned is that they can beat their wings up to 800 times per second, which is it's so difficult to imagine that, to wrap one's head around that, not too unlike trying to wrap your head around 541 million years of this Manhattan schist material. And so it's these irrational moments and these different scales of time that to bring into a moment an experiential situation for a viewer to kind of try and grapple with or experience and bear witness to in some kind of way, or at least that's how I think about it. Oh, I think you're muted there, Julie.
Well, I think that piece is actually just really fascinating for the notion of scale. You know, we go to the Natural History Museum and we learn about geology. You can walk through deep time. And somehow, I think for many people, or maybe I just speak for myself, it goes kind of in one eye and out the other. I get it, but I don't really get it. But I think that what you did at Governor's Island, maybe this is where art can succeed in a way where science doesn't always communicate in the most effective way. That contrast of the really, really fast, small things that we can see and the enormity of the deep time that we can't see, but you've made it visible for us. But bringing those two things together, two different kinds of time in the world and on the earth, I think just goes such a long way toward communicating that notion and kind of where we stand within it. And maybe that's a good opportunity for us to sort of stop here and take some questions from the audience. But I think that it's a great indication for me of why art is so important in these discussions and how much it can bring to the table and how much agency it can give to the viewer, because it can reach the viewer on such a different level than a kind of information drop that you might get in a natural history museum.
Yeah, just to make one quick comment on that idea that, you know, we live in a time where the idea of seeing many things simultaneously is even more pronounced today than ever before. So it's, you know, of course, you can use the obvious example of like the internet, and then I can be doing all these 5 different things I'm looking at. There's probably some people on this Zoom meeting here that are even in a different country, and so this idea of simultaneity and experiencing multiple things at the exact same moment, or even seeing the same thing from different lenses in the exact same moment, is part of our kind of cultural, is a hallmark of our time in a sense. But same thing is like when we think of the biosphere, there's the biosphere, but there's also within that ecosystems and biomes. Within that there are species, and within that there are populations of species, and within that there are individuals within that population. So you can see how the notion of simultaneity is really important here to be able to actually digest these multiple ways of seeing the exact same thing at different lenses. So that's just an important thing, I think, also about that. Just want to add that comment on there.
Well, I get what you're saying, but I think also it's easy for us to understand just the idea that something can be moving very fast, and even though it's hard to grasp 800 wing beats per second, it's still something we can imagine, something like a hummingbird, only on speed and smaller. But by being able to imagine something really fast, it helps make sense of the really slow. I think that you could read one through the other, that you could imagine something moving so fast you can imagine that it's hard to picture. And then
Yeah.
you can imagine that what you're looking at here is so old that you just have no idea. And I think that that's really what, bringing those two things together, it's a situation. It also has, I think, a lot of aesthetic value, but it communicates in a way that I think is really hard to communicate these issues through strictly a lens of science. So I think it's just a great space to operate that intersection.
Yeah.
And the educational aspect is there, but it's also, you make it visual. I think in addition to a society of simultaneity, we are very visual right now. Everything is a picture. And so it helps to see it. And so that makes it easier to imagine.
All right. Thank you, Julie, for your wonderful questions and insight into David's work. We're reaching this point where we're going to move on to the questions and answer section. And I saw a question in there from Rebecca. I'm going to ask to unmute you if you'd like to ask your question. Rebecca, you are unmuted.
Good afternoon. Hi, David.
Hi, Rebecca.
Good to see you. I've been so curious how your creative process and your life's work has like informed the way you're acclimating to the pandemic. You know, just knowing, anyway, I won't go on about that, but yeah, like how are you experiencing this, and how does it help you see your work in new ways, or how has your processes helped you understand the times we're in?
Great question, and it's one I ask all of my other artist friends, because it's you know, it's kind of like when you do an activity and you realize you haven't exercised that muscle forever, and it's like, oh, I haven't exercised that muscle in a long time. There's something happening with that now for me, and that some days are extremely productive and clear-headed in a sense, because you know, a lot of we've all heard people discuss how nice it is to not have the rush of life and the daily grind, and be able to have that time to do this thing that you put off. But also that slowness, that time, that contemplative space comes at a great loss for others. And so it's a very strange time in that there's also a mourning that goes on, and an anxiety. So some days are really productive for me and some are not. I will say though that the pandemic and watching it evolve in a sense is another, could be seen as another element or another example of an accelerated situation of what we understand about environmental degradation and climate change itself. And I mean, the same factors that have pushed this zoolytic spillover from one species into another of this virus, it's the same kind of pressure that we've been putting on our natural systems around us for centuries. And so it's an acceleration point where we now are being forced to look at it. I do just hope that collectively, just as a people, that we can see it, that it has a reason why it's been happening. It's not just nature being bad. People are good. It's in fact, we've pressured this situation to happen. And so it is our own shooting ourselves in the foot. I just worry that there's a lot of suffering that comes from that. So that's where my head goes when you ask that question, because for me, it's this same deliberation that I've been dealing with as a thinking, like, sensitive human being. And I'm seeing it now, like enveloping the entire planet. And so I just hope that realization, that light bulb is not lost as things start to kind of quasi open up, and there will be some norm that people go back to. I think this is a really extraordinarily important, like, existential awakening that can be taken advantage of here and thought about deeper. So so it's affected my work just in like, okay, we're all in the same boat literally now, and we all know it. And so there's an awareness of that I think is important. But it's hard, you know, right now we're in the middle of planning 2 biodiversity survey expeditions, one to the headwaters of the Amazon River and the Marañón River. And there's 20 hydroelectric dams being slated for construction in this river valley, which is a river valley famous for its endemics. Endemics are things that are found only in that one place and nowhere else on the planet. And so both of birds and countless species of fish never even sampled or surveyed at any kind. And at the same time, it's one of the richest kind of indigenous cultural veins in that entire part of the Amazon. And so here's a situation where you have massive hydroelectric dams going in and an erasure of an entire vocabulary of evolution, as well as of a people, and which will have its own extinction loss, both of language and cultural ways. And so all, again, being brought to this accelerated moment. And so it is an interesting situation, though, to be trying to plan that project while we're all on Zoom calls with folks in Peru, Chile, Colombia, Australia, Canada, New York, and me in New Orleans. And so it's a bizarre situation about how it affects the work, because also it can only remain hypothetical, because if the virus continues, or if the virus has outbreaks in some of these more remote regions in the Amazonian basin, especially as it starts to affect indigenous peoples, I mean, it could also transform the entire project in another way. So there's a lot of hypothetical aspects going on all fronts, including art making. You know, there's a number of projects that have been postponed. There's supposedly one that's going to open in September, but that's a big if it can be opened. We don't really know in that sense. But I think it's a healthy time. It makes us confront and question, rather, and challenge the formats that we use. And that maybe there's something in this video call right now that is a much more untapped, important format to think about, that has a smaller carbon footprint and a less pressure on something. But I mean, anyway. So it's, yeah. See, you opened a can of worms, Rebecca.
All right, thank you, Rebecca, for your question. And please, if anyone has any questions for David, please drop them in the chat, and I'll call on you. But the next one, we're going to go to our very own Nick Bennett. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, David, Julie. Forgive me for just hiding behind a photo right now. My connection's not the best, but I wanted to make sure my audio could come through. But I had the pleasure, David, of working with you on two rail curatorial projects. The first at MANA in 2017, and then recently at Colby Museum in 2019. Mm-hmm. And in those shows, you had a piece, as we saw earlier, the repositioned core. And I'm curious how your work corresponds to different spaces that it's installed in. It was really interestingly laid out, like in its entirety at MANA, and you could really get the scope of the linearity of it. But then in another space, it was kind of, would you say, sort of truncated on itself. I guess, and I know that you've installed it in many different ways as well. So using that particular piece as an example, I'm curious how you think of installing your works in gallery or institutional or art-related spaces.
I think of it a little bit as like every time there's a different person that comes into the same room, they're going to behave a little differently. And they'll also affect how somebody else next to them is behaving. So there's a uniqueness to it and a rarity to that I think is important. And it's not necessarily a repeatable situation. So instead of the work being its own sovereign kind of autonomous thing, I always try and find a way to let it not only be informed by, but actually literally take the shape of something in the environment which is presented. To me, that's also, I mean, this is very abstract, but in a sense, it's an attitude towards materiality that I think is important. It's an attitude towards materiality that demonstrates its interrelatedness with the things around it. So that's a very lofty thought for some rocks that are just moved around in the space, but it's true. And so, so in terms of the institutional settings, though, yeah, it's it's a necessary situation. You know, it's one of our formats. It's how we've all collectively agreed as a society that that white cube over there represents like art viewing space, as opposed to say my bathroom floor. You know, and so since we've all collectively decided that's going to be what it is, I think it's just important to also acknowledge that that context, that it is still a bunch of white walls that are made of sheetrock that have actually corn-based glue adhering the paper to the gypsum that is painted white, and that somewhere along the lines we decided that painting it white was an idea of neutrality, and so that's also a really rarefied kind of situation in its own right. And so positioning works in that way. I mean, that's just where my brain goes, and it's a matter of letting the works create their own situation, so that they're not the same every time they're moved around, but they actually create and generate a new situation that have to have a response in a sense.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Nick. Next, we got a question from Philip. I'm going to ask to unmute you. Philip, are you there? Okay. Okay, we got another question here from JC.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. I was on a small screen. So I looked at what you've been showing, and my question was whether you have text that accompanies these exhibitions to explain to the public what your intentions are through these objects that they're looking at.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, because when you push the button and turn me on, I can talk for an hour or two about this backstory of a project, and but in the end, it's concrete covering trees, or it's some rock cores, it's some rocks and mud and sand that are situated on a scaffolding system, or it's a buried tractor, or a branch cast in bronze. But so you'd have to be kind of crazy to come to the project and bringing together that whole cluster of different ways, or the backstory and the research that went into the project. So there is text, but I don't think that it's always important that, in fact, it's definitely not important that for certain projects that people read through all the depths of the backstory in order to get the work. I think that the work, the artwork itself does generate its own kind of situation, and it broadcasts a certain kind of reality about it, even if that's an irrational reality. And so the answer, though, the faster answer, quicker answer, is just that there's always text, and there's a very high level of didactics usually. In fact, the pieces Nick was talking about that were installed at the Colby Museum and at Mana Contemporary, there are even takeaway publications on the kind of backstory of that material. And so the didactics I treat like a material as well, that they're there to situate, contextualize something. But I leave different kind of levels of them there for people. I'm the kind of person, when I go to a museum, people really hate going to museums with me often, because I'll sit there and read every single label, which is very annoying to some. I'm that kind of person, and so as much backstory and didactics that an artist will present to me, I'll generally go through all of it. But some people don't want to, and they don't care to, and I don't think they really need to. So I think there's I try and find a balance between that, so that there are levels of that, or different dimensions of that, for what people, how people actually engage artwork. Less about telling them what to do, and actually letting them go through it in their own kind of way. So yeah, I do have a lot of didactics and text, but it's there in a way that you can engage it or not if you don't want to.
Okay. Thank you, Philip, for your question. Next, we'll go to JC. You want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. Sweet. David, thank you so much for this conversation. Lovely to hear you speak. As always, Julie, thank you for your questions and your hosting. Okay, so my question is characteristically really long. Sorry in advance. You both talked about hubris earlier in the conversation. And I feel like a lot of the way that we talk about human impact, on our environment, reflects that. Anthropocene, as if we're the only animals that affect the biosphere. Like trees definitely do so at least as much. And so I guess my question is, like, how do you think about or conceptualize human impact on our habitats as something natural? How do you talk about human action without moralizing it? Like, we're starting to see that in the humanities, this language of not moralizing people's actions and blaming it on more on like the context, but we like definitely don't see that at all when the two agents are like a human and a non-human creature. Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Julie, you want to start on that one? You might be muted there, Julie.
Okay, I said I couldn't unmute myself, but now I can. So, JC, if I understand your question right, you're looking at ways of understanding the impact, the point where humans and nature meet, and not in a moralizing way. I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Well, like, I guess I'm thinking about okay, so like one example is like the highest concentration of peregrine falcons in the world lives in New York City. So we have this like totally built environment that is obviously like net probably not good for the estuary of the Hudson River, but it's not like it's not like completely negative. Like it offers a kind of habitat in its own way, both to humans and to non-humans. And the idea of being like cities are bad seems like it just doesn't really like connect, like encompass that sort of complexity.
In a way, what I would say is it's almost too late to say, you know, cities are bad and to moralize. I mean, if you want to make an analogy with the virus, you know, we need to learn to coexist, and we already are. In some ways, nature shows the way. The different kinds of coral that are flourishing in acidic waters, nature will adapt, but you know, not enough. And I think it's hard to avoid the moralizing, because as we damage the natural world, we're killing what we need in order to survive, and making refugees out of people all over the world. You know, we cut down trees and silt runs into the water, and the fish are smaller, and the water's cloudy, and the birds can't see them, and we don't see the all of the effects, the domino effect of what we're doing, until suddenly it kind of comes up and sort of bites us in the butt. So I think it's hard not to feel moralizing about that. But on the at the same time, I think you're right to point out that there has been a lot of adaptation. There's been cities for a long time. This is not new. The industrial age began quite a long time ago now. So I think that you know, we're already living in a very adapted world. There's, you know, I was up at Whiteface Mountain in the Adirondacks last summer learning about how I was in fact inhaling air from China, you know, that this air just comes right over. We're all in it now. There's no separation. And, you know, but I do think that some moralizing is important so that people understand not to just accept what is as what is. I don't like to think that there's any silver lining to the coronavirus. I think there is none. But at the same time, it is true that people have been able to see maybe some aspects of nature a little bit more clearly, maybe get the point that our actions are in fact what's making things look and feel and smell the way they do. That it's hard if you only see the one. If your baseline is smog, you start to think that's just the way it is, right? So maybe this has shown us a little bit that it's that way for a reason, and could be a different way. But as I said, I wouldn't want to think of it as a silver lining. So anyway, long answer, a little bit long-winded to your question.
Yeah, but just to add to that, Julie, when you were speaking with Mark and Alexis a few weeks ago, you know, it was brought up about the imagery of so-called wildlife running through urban places, and people were delighted to see penguins walking through downtown Cape Town, or elephants charging through certain cities, and in a sense, and dolphins in the canals of Venice, which apparently
that was a hoax. Yeah.
It's hilarious, but people really delighting in that, and that it's, but that also in you all's discussion, I think you were really correct to call those actually kind of scenes of disaster and a horror, and that's the result of something that it takes a certain kind of situation to be able to have that soberness to see what that is. I mean, that really actually is an image of a catastrophe, and because we might even be calling them wildlife and then running through our urban center, like there's a lack of an understanding of even their own rights to be able to live. And so that gets back to JC, your question, in a sense that I think that on the one hand, it's a great question because it forces one to think outside of just the human lens, which, you know, I've tried to do in certain projects. Where recently I did a project where I was with using drones and things, trying to see this particular manicured landscape from the perspective of a bird, which I, you know, utterly failed at. But I think in hindsight, the failure of my ability to do that is important. But it's a little bit of like this idea of trying to see outside the anthropogenic lens, and I think that's a really important thing. I guess the one thing that I always come back to is like, so sure, there's like the pythons in South Florida, which is a horrible situation where the Burmese python has become a massively invasive species. It's consumed 94% of the mammals in the Everglades, and there's no stopping the numbers of them. On the one hand, one could, but then this kind of lynch mob approach to going out and just decimating the pythons has led to other problems where other snakes are being decimated at the same time because people don't know what they're getting or what they're doing. But you could feel for that one individual Burmese python, of course, like, but it also, in order to save a whole other host of non-humans that we might not even be entirely aware of, yet the python has to be limited in some way. Usually natural systems and the rates of evolution, the idea of invasive is a complicated word and kind of ties into this a bit. But I mean, of course, human beings could be considered invasive. And with the migration of species across the continents, break up at Pangea, things drift and move and migrate and then adapt again. That is certainly all could be considered invasive species as they move. The difference, though, would be that they move and they adapt at the rate at which evolution and natural systems allow them to, and that they can do it kind of, no, I don't want to say like hand in hand with big heart, like collectively do it, but they're doing it in a way that things are, that things have to play themselves out. And so there is I guess I come back to the thing of like, okay, so I don't like killing this one Burmese python or the idea of that, but also I feel like I have an obligation to be able to, two things. One, that I'm aware of the history of what brought this python there. I'm aware, I can understand and see the devastation that is happening with this, and it's happening at a rate that none of the natural systems that are there can do anything to kind of limit anything. So we'll just render it a desert in a sense. And so, so I do have then an obligation to kind of help with that situation, and even if it means the killing of this. I mean, it's an irrational human situation again. And I think that's a great question though, because it forces us to think outside of that one lens. And it's a hard one. There's no one way to, there's no really one easy way to see it, which is why it's a very interdisciplinary thing. You know, it's a very important interdisciplinary thing, and it takes everybody and it takes the non-humans as well. But anyway, that was some thoughts on that. But
I could just add one very quick thing to that. The penguins going to visit other creatures in the aquarium was one thing, but the penguins being taken to the Nelson Atkins Museum to look at art recently, I thought that was actually quite interesting. Like, I really had to think about what that meant, you know, how meaningless our cultural production would be to penguins. But anyway, just thinking about that.
Thanks.
All right, we've got one more question that was just announced from Sai. Sai, I will unmute you. There.
Hi, David. My question was about the project you were talking about on Governor's Island with the core sample and with the movement of the hummingbird and the mosquito and the perceptions of time between like larger and smaller organisms. You know, the idea of like a housefly being able to see individual frames of like movies, or a hummingbird being able to like react much quicker than a human can. And you know, our idea as a human of the Anthropocene being a geological age, but you know, in reality, the deposit layer that we've left so far being a lot more analogous, a lot closer to a violent event that happens than an actual geological age. And so I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit more about how you think about or deal with in your work these varying perceptions of time and scale.
You have an hour and a half?
I do.
I think I think that on the one hand, yeah, good question, complicated question, deep question. I think on the one hand, to bring it back to what I was saying in the very beginning of this hour, I think that being able to ascertain one's place within multitudes of different scales of time, which is also part of understanding one's place in an ecosystem, even though it may not look like it. I am also in the middle of an ecosystem right now. And so being able to see those different, whether the minutia, the granular, or these larger spans and swaths of time, again, that simultaneity, but also being able to think outside one's own lifespan, I think brings that level of responsibility or agency back to the person. But in terms of like how, I want to say that one other thing, and then I'll say a little bit more about the art, its use in the work, but it's also that we know that even molecules at the bottom of the Marianas Trench in the ocean, at the deepest point on Earth's surface, has also been impacted by both plastic, but also radioactive particles. And so we know that it's penetrated trees in the center of really remote regions of the Amazon have different growth rings and different growth spurts and different constrictions of growth as well, based on human impacts around climate change and acid rain and these things that can actually reach these far-flung areas. So it is very much an anthropic event and an what did you call it, Sai? An anthro-violence? Is that what you call this?
Oh, like a violent event, like a meteor strike or a volcanic eruption.
Yeah, but I actually think it's so many layers of residue that are building up, and so it is a volcanic event in a sense, but it's at the same time it is many layers building up over time. So, but in terms of like how incorporating that into the work, I think it's on the one hand, let's say like. The Storm King piece with the castings of the branches. I mean, I think it's a really clear idea of time, but there's also that element of an unknown, and I'm not really sure what's going to happen with certain aspects, and certain things that hillside may collapse. Storm King may sell the property and it becomes a Ramada Inn. We don't really know what's going to happen, although they are situated there forever. So it's purposely just meant to actually have to ask the questions of what is that relationship to time, and then therefore one's sense of responsibility while you have this time. And I think for me, it's a matter of bringing as many of those clusters and scales of it together at the same time that helps. I think that the more different scales of that into a situation or a work, the better for me in a work. I think that kind of begins to answer your question. Was that along the lines of what you were asking?
I think so. I think like also the notion of bringing them together in the space and time of the artwork is thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's also, when I first went to the Museum of Modern Art as like 18, I guess, and I see like a Brancusi sculpture there, I see it as an autonomous object, sure, because I was trained culturally to see it as this isolated thing that is supposed to be the same sculpture, whether or not it's in MoMA or whether it's out in a parking lot or whether it's in a trash heap. It's still supposed to be the same thing, but I can't help but look at everything else or what it's made of. I want to know what the material was. Same with what at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there's the John Rockefeller, the nephew of the governor, who had gone at the age of 23 to Papua New Guinea to collect these artifacts from there and then bring them back. And he died along the way and was supposedly cannibalized. There's this whole story behind that. And when I was an 18-year-old looking at these objects that I had never seen an object like that in my life, not even in a book, and was in wonderment around them and trying to understand what language they are. And then as I was more interested in the life around it. And so, and in fact, those objects were made to actually be lived and used. And so that element is really important. The context around it, the life around it is a whole other set of time relationships. And we're all going to come to that with a different relationship to it and where we come from. And so that, and rather than an autonomous thing that is supposed to mean the same thing to everybody, no matter where it is, this idea that something can be be perforated and have these different options for people to come to it depending on their backgrounds. But something like it loosens this up. It allows for variation. It allows for different comings together in a sense. So, okay, that was that went long. Sorry.
Thank you, Sai, for the question. We've unfortunately run out of time, but I want to thank Priscilla and Jay Sebastian and Justin for their questions in the chat. The Rail has a daily ritual of ending lunch with a poem. And so today we're thrilled to have renowned poet Brenda Coultas read for us. Brenda Coultas's poetry can be found in Bomb in the Brooklyn Rail, and the anthologies Reading in Contemporary Poetry, published by the Dia Art Foundation, What is Poetry? Just Kidding, I Know You Know, interviews from the Poetry Project newsletter, and Symmetries, 3 years of art and poetry at Dominique Levy. This spring, Coultas completed an artist residency at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation in Captiva, Florida. So without further ado, it's been unmuted. Brenda, you want to take it away?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can everyone hear? Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to read one poem that was written in Captiva at the beginning of the pandemic. Unwritten. Not a fiction, although I have told some tall tales. Not an essay, for I have no argument. Not a memoir, for I've already said it all. Not a suicide note, for I wish to live. Not a farewell message, for this is not goodbye. Not a message in a bottle, for I'm not lost at sea. Not a poem, for I'm out of beauty. Not a to-do list, for I'm kept awake by all that I have left undone and unsaid. I took in particles through my spiked nose. Droplets of narrative ran down the back of throat and flooded my guts with a ponderous arc and put a lion's paw in my lap. Turn off the news and start to undo. In a bronze chair on the edge of jungle and beach, I ponder the arc and flood, hippos, sheep, and giraffes 2 by 2. Consider the manatee, dog of the sea, as a snout rises up for air. How many days in close quarters? What did Noah smell like? Horse sweat or hay? More than one flood made this world. I ponder enormously how wicked we were when the earth shook us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That's a beautiful poem. All right, and that concludes today's New Social Environment. Thank you for joining us today. Please be sure to tune in on Monday for a talk between Raymond Foy and Tamara Gonzalez. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, David.
Thanks for the round team.
Brenda, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Great to be on with you.
Beautiful reading, beautiful poem, beautiful reading. I'm so touched. And thank you, David. And thank you, Julie. Wow, what an exceptional conversation. Learned so much. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you, Fong.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much, people.
All right. Thank
Yes.
Thank you, Brenda.
Great to see everyone.